Hello and welcome to our March Lunchbox lecture. I am John Long, the Director of Education here at the National D-Day Memorial, and it's a beautiful day in Bedford. If you have not visited in a while, come on by. If not today, probably pretty soon. Can't tell you an exact date, but we'll have our cherry trees coming out. So make a plan to stop by, take a tour if you haven't in a while, or just look around and enjoy nature. Our new walking trail, a lot of exciting things going on as we get ready for the 80th anniversary of D-Day coming up later this year. But today, we are very excited to offer this lunchbox lecture with an old friend of the National D-Day Memorial. Maggie Hartley worked here with a number of us, been a little bit of staff turnover, but many of us on staff and many of our volunteers have very fond memories of giving Maggie a hard time about a lot of different things, and she gave us as good as she received. So we are very excited to see what has happened with her career and to have her back today for this virtual lecture on Martha Gellhorn, the absolutely fascinating war correspondent that you're going to learn about as we go forward. But let me give a quick introduction of Dr. Maggie Hartley, and that's right, doctor with an actual PhD to her name. But Maggie is a museum educator passionate about engaging audiences of all ages with history and with the experience of veterans. She's currently the Director of Public Engagement at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. Very proud of that connection we have where Maggie has gone on, and we can say we knew her when. She's before she went on to such big and great things. So she oversees public programming, outreach, and interpretation. Previously, she was here at the National D-Day Memorial, planning programming as the Associate Director of Programming and Events. She went through a number of titles, were you a volunteer before you were an intern?
No, I was an intern first.
Intern, yeah, she was an intern and just really took off from there. And also helped to organize the Central and Southwest Virginia Honor Flight, which brings veterans to the memorial, certainly still, but also to Washington, D.C. to be honored for their service. She has her doctorate in education and leadership from Virginia Commonwealth University, a master's and a bachelor's in history from Liberty University. And as I say, I've just been really proud of the job that she has done, both here at the National D-Day Memorial and then in New Orleans, where if you've never been to that great museum, make a plan to visit as well. But I'm going to turn it over now to Maggie to tell us all about the fascinating Martha Gellhorn.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, John, for that introduction. I will say that it is incredibly exciting to join everyone, even though it is virtual and I'm still in New Orleans right now. I do hope to make it up to Virginia soon and hope that many of you guys will also plan to make trips here to New Orleans. I absolutely love when our Bedford friends come down and I get to show them around the museum and show them the fascinating history that's in New Orleans as well. And so today's lecture is something that really came about from my time at the National D-Day Memorial. You know, when I was there, I was giving field trips and talking about the 150,000 men that landed on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944. And I started thinking, I was like, there has to be more to that. I wonder if there was what the female involvement was. You know, you hear about female nurses and so forth, but was there more to that? And that's how I came across the story of Martha Gellhorn. And her story is fascinating. You know, a lot of times she's often just seen as Hemingway's third wife. There's more to her than that. She grew up in incredible conditions, really started pushing boundaries at a young age, and really led her to tell dynamic stories of war throughout her career. And so I hope you're just as excited as I am to dive into a little bit of her life history, because in order to understand how she's able to tell these incredible stories from the war, you have to understand where she came from. And so before we dive into that, I do want to, let me move to the screen. Perfect. Thank you, Adam. I do want to talk just briefly about female wartime correspondents. I know today it is so easy to just think, well, there had to have been women in World War II that were reporting on it. And there were, but it's not in the numbers that we see today. I remember growing up listening to Martha Raddatz and Lara Logan talk about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Even recently, Courtney Kuby with NBC News was on the USS Eisenhower in the Red Sea. She was their correspondent in the action. That's commonplace now. Back in World War II, only 6% of the correspondents during wartime were female. Only 6%. And especially now, you don't hear often about wartime correspondents being killed in action or even injured. They're often a bit more protected despite being right there in the action, as you even see from Lara Logan's photo. But there were over 60 war correspondents killed during the war. It was a very dangerous activity to engage in, to be able to report what's happening, the authentic actions. And in comparison, that 6% from World War II, there's over 40% of journalists today who are female. And you really have to credit Martha Gellhorn for really pushing that path forward. Her career spanned over 60 years, essentially. During World War II, Times Magazine called Gellhorn one of Collier's star reporters. But her reputation wasn't just built on the stories of generals and officers and battle plans and strategies. It was built on telling the experiences of ordinary people, their strength of character, especially in challenging times. She didn't write about war for ratings. She wrote to show the different ways that war disrupts all parts of life. And throughout her almost 60-year career, she participated in almost every major conflict that the United States was involved in. But of course, she didn't start out immediately as a wartime correspondent. She was born in November of 1908 to George and Edna Gellhorn. Her father was a German-born gynecologist, and her mother was a suffragist and supporter of women's rights. So at a very young age, Martha was learning about pushing boundaries, not just accepting what society is telling is expected of you. At 8 years old, she participated in what's known today as the Golden Lane, which you'll see on the screen in this photo. It was a rally for women's suffrage at the Democratic Party's 1916 National Convention in St. Louis, Missouri. The women were carrying yellow parasols and wearing yellow sashes. They lined both sides of the main street heading to the St. Louis Coliseum, where this convention was occurring. In front of the art museum along this path, there was a tableau of states. And the states that had not allowed women the right to vote were draped in black. This was a very big statement that was occurring, especially in a pivotal election year. Gellhorn and another girl, they stood at the front of the line. They were symbolic of future generations of female voters that needed to have this opportunity. And so it was right there in the Democratic Party's face as they were moving into their convention. And so this, of course, this had to have been an incredibly influential moment for her. She was learning how to step out again, outside of the societal boundaries, challenging what you're just supposed to accept and do, even at 8 years old. She would go on to graduate high school in 1926 from John Burroughs School, which her mother is incredible. I feel like I almost need to do a lecture on her mother as well, because her mother founded this private prep school that really helped build Martha up to what she became. And so you hear about all these achievements already at such a young age, and you're thinking, Martha Gellhorn had to have gone to Harvard, Yale, whatever. She ended up going to Bryn Mawr. She was supposed to be a part of the class of 1930, but she ended up being a college dropout. She left after a year to pursue a career as a journalist. She knew what she wanted to do and wasn't going to let anything stop her, even not having a college degree. Her first published works appeared in the New Republic, And in 1930, she was determined to become a foreign correspondent. And so she moved to France for 2 years, where she worked at the United Press Bureau in Paris. She was fired after she reported sexual harassment by a coworker. So she also wasn't willing to tolerate bad behavior towards herself or others in the workplace. And you'll see this as a recurring theme as well in her life. After that, she spent years just traveling Europe. She'd write for newspapers, both in Paris and St. Louis. And surprisingly, you hear about this wartime correspondent, this suffragette, and she also covered fashion for Vogue. So kind of a twist in what you would expect from her, but, she really was a dynamic person, as you'll see throughout her life. She became active in the pacifist movement, and she wrote about her experiences, both throughout her should-be college years, traveling Europe, in a book called What Mad Pursuit, which was published in 1934. This book, many reviewers claimed it was juvenile. She was telling this fiction story about 3 college friends finding their way in the world, but really, again, based it off of her own experiences. A review from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle in November of 1934 said, "I do not know whether or not Martha Gellhorn is a novice in the field of fiction. I do know that her genius is obviously still in the embryo and will require further development." So when you see something like that, it's easy to get disappointed. I do want to point out, though, the reviewer had optimism about her growth, and we will see that. However, it is believed that she took it very hard. It was never reprinted. This was the only edition of the book, and she rarely listed it in her list of published works. And it really is different from the rest of her writing, as we'll see in just a moment. It really forced her to change how she approached her career. So in the same time as the Great Depression. And so that, of course, changed the world. And it was during this time that Martha Gellhorn met Eleanor Roosevelt, who, of course, was another boundary pusher of her times, was willing to meet with people who didn't exactly look like her or think like her, and was an advocate for women, for African Americans, you name it. She was there to listen and to provide support. They had a friendship that was lifelong despite their 30-year age gap. Gellhorn would go on to describe Eleanor as this: she gave off light. No one seeing her could fail to be moved. The Roosevelts often invited Gellhorn over to the White House, and she spent many evenings there helping Miss Roosevelt write correspondence in the First Lady's My Day column, which was published in the Women's Home Companion. It was through this relationship with the Roosevelts that she was hired as a field investigator for the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, which I'll refer to as FARA, as most of the alphabet soup for the New Deal administrations are often used in their abbreviations. And so Gellhorn would go on to travel the United States, working for FARA, reporting on how the Great Depression was affecting the country. Her first stop was Gastonia, North Carolina, and then she would later be joined by Dorothea Lange, a photographer who also documented the everyday lives of the hungry and homeless. Their reports together would become part of the official government files for the Great Depression. And this opportunity allowed them to investigate topics that were not usually open to women of the 1930s. It would be towards the later part of this period where Martha would take this time and draw on her research to write a collection of short stories called The Trouble I've Seen in 1936. One review of The Trouble I've Seen, which was published in the Wilkes-Barre Record in October of 1936, says, "Should you pick up The Trouble I've Seen by Martha Gellhorn, skip the H.G. Wells preface and plunge right in. If you can take your eyes off the page, you're stronger than this reader, but they may blur with tears even if you are strong." The review goes on to give synopses of some of the stories featured in the book, and at the very end says, "The other stories are as good. Perhaps superb is the better word." So within 2 years, you have very drastic reviews. One that's still calling her an embryo, and the other one that's saying that her work is superb, the way that she is connecting with these everyday stories. One could argue that this is when she embraced this form of writing, which really inspired how she would go on to tell stories about the war. Now, what's interesting is during her time at FARA in Idaho, Martha Gellhorn convinced a group of workers to break the windows of the FARA office located there in order to draw attention to the activities of their crooked boss. Although this worked, it definitely drew attention to the situation. She was fired from FARA, so she then had no job, had nowhere to live, and was actually invited to come live at the White House with Eleanor Roosevelt. She was assigned to respond to mail to the First Lady, but it was also during this time that she had the ability to write The Trouble I've Seen. So after the Great Depression, this is when her life takes a turn, right? Everyone, as I mentioned at the beginning, knows that she was the third wife of Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway was a huge figure in the literary sphere of the early 20th century. And so, you can't often talk about the 40s and 30s without thinking about Hemingway. And I do want to take a moment to say it's important to know that a lot of her World War II story is wrapped up in his shadow, but she is so much more than that. And I hope that you'll take that away as a part of this lecture. So on a family Christmas trip in 1936, her family was getting together, herself, her brother, and her mother after her father had died. They ended up at the famous bar Sloppy Joe's, and that's where she met Ernest Hemingway, and that's where her life would start to take a change. This is where they became friends and decided that they would work together to get to Spain after they started talking about what was happening with the Spanish Civil War. Both were essentially budding journalists, despite their established literary careers. They wanted to be wartime correspondents and wanted to get into the action and tell those stories. And so they saw this as their opportunity to break in. Keep in mind at this time, he was married to his second wife, Pauline. They lived in Key West with their sons. So he basically went with Gellhorn, and that kind of started this new trajectory for him. So for the Spanish Civil War, she would be assigned to cover it by colliers. She traveled to Spain with just a duffel bag, some tin cans of food, and her last $50. And that's where she met up with Hemingway. They would end up celebrating Christmas together in 1937 in Barcelona. And it would be during that time that she would cover stories such as the bombings of Barcelona. She would talk about the stories of soldiers in hospitals and life in the trenches on the front lines. She was known for capturing the experience of war. She's quoted as saying, "I was afraid that I would forget the exact sounds, smell, words, gestures, which were special to this moment and this place." She really wanted to capture all of the senses that were occurring with war. In an early piece for The New Yorker, she would even describe a convoy of tanks in the dark outside of Madrid. She said they, quote, looked as if 6 boats with only their harbor lights showing were tied together, riding a gentle sea. I will make a quick note here that it really sounds a lot like Hemingway there. Her writing style, especially in that descriptive nature, really has made a bit of a turn in that direction. It's very clear she's been spending a lot of time with him at this point. Hemingway goes home after the Spanish Civil War. Once it's clear that the fascists are taking over, Martha's not done yet. She decides to travel to Czechoslovakia in 1939, March of 1939, to cover the Pole perspective as the Nazis were moving into Czechoslovakia. She would then travel to Helsinki as the Russians were moving in and bombed the city in the fall. So she wasn't ready to go home quite yet. She would write her book, A Stricken Field, looking at the refugee crisis that was occurring in Czechoslovakia after the Munich Pact in 1938. And this is still something that is often talked about in college classrooms today when looking at refugee crises from then until now. It is interesting to note, too, that instead of writing about the Spanish Civil War, she chose to write about Czechoslovakia, and we'll get back to that in a moment. Eventually, she goes to Cuba. She joins Ernest Hemingway in Cuba. That's where he loves to go. He loved going there after his time in Key West as well. And when she arrives, he's holed up in a hotel room. She doesn't want anything to do with that. So he purchases the Fincia Viega, which is still located just outside of Havana. It's a waterfront property. Believe it or not, they only paid $12,000 for it back in the day. Would really love to see those types of home prices now, especially for a house of that magnitude. They first rented it, of course, bought it. And this really was kind of their way of settling down. His divorce from his second wife was final in 1940. And just a few months later, December of 1940, in Wyoming, they were married. It was one of Hemingway's favorite places. So their time in Cuba, really at the beginning, was still domestic bliss. Hemingway was writing For Whom the Bells Toll, arguably his most famous work from his career. And note that at the same time he was writing this about the Spanish Civil War was when she was writing her book, A Stricken Field, about Czechoslovakia. A lot of her memoirs later reflect on the Spanish Civil War as being incredibly impactful for her, but she chose not to write on it, and it's suspected that the reason for that is that she didn't want to compete with Hemingway at that point. Once she finished writing, she found ways to preoccupy herself with renovating the house because she was itching to get back into the war. On the other hand, Hemingway would often spend his days on fishing on his boat, the Pilar, or writing or attempting to write, but drinking daiquiris. One fun fact about Hemingway during this period in Cuba with the Pilar is that he was actually assigned to hunt for U-boats in the Caribbean. He even outfitted his boat with a comm system and a defense mechanism by putting a Thompson on board along with a few grenades. Surprisingly, he had no luck finding a U-boat. I think we can all assume why. And supposedly he only did this for extra gas rations and to keep the Cuban police from arresting him for a DUI by earning some favor there. So interesting way to contribute to the war effort, right? So as I mentioned earlier, Martha Gellhorn's itching to get back into the war. She loves covering war stories. And so in 1941, before the attack at Pearl Harbor, she'd been reached out to by colliers for a job to report on the situation in China. And so this was considered essentially their honeymoon trip, 100 days in Asia. She had to convince Hemingway to come along. He really didn't want to. In her book, Travels with Myself and Another, she spends the very beginning of it saying that he was an unwilling companion and that for the rest of this book, she will, in reference to Hemingway, use UC in place. So very strong feelings after the fact about this. Now, I will say, even though he was an unwilling companion, once he had agreed to go on this, he was reached out to by the Treasury Department to spy on what was happening in China and report back. The Treasury Department wanted to know more about the Sino-Japanese War, and more importantly, what was going on between the communist and the nationalist forces in China. So, of course, they ended up taking this long path over. They actually stopped in Pearl Harbor for just a little bit before making their way to Hong Kong. Gellhorn would travel to Burma alone to report on what was going on and then make her way back to Hong Kong and join Hemingway. There she would visit the city markets, opium dens, and brothels, and started reporting on the squalid social conditions that were endured by a Chinese immigrant population seeking refuge in Hong Kong. The Chinese people surprised Gellhorn, though. From a news story in 1941, she says, they accept calmly anything that happens: hunger, fatigue, cold, thirst, pain, or danger. They trudged through rain-soaked, muddy tracks on horseback and traveled by riverboat to get to the front. So they really were moving throughout this whole area as well. Gellhorn was appalled by the squalor and unsanitary conditions in these war-ravaged areas that she traveled to. She described the shoeless soldiers as having faces like orphan ghosts. And during this time, she managed to contract a case of China rot. And if you know what that is, you know it's not enjoyable. It's essentially a skin condition, rather like athlete's foot. It was a familiar complaint for war correspondents on the China front. And even though they went to a lot of different locations, they never did see action. The nationalist forces were very much clear about making sure they didn't see what was fully going on with the war. She would also, during this time, meet with Chiang Kai-shek and his wife. This would be on April 14th, the day after Stalin signed a non-aggression pact with Japan, which had profound implications on the Sino-Japanese War. And during their time in China, the U.S. also ended all trade with Japan. In her book, Travels with Myself and Another, she goes on to describe her interactions with the Chiangs as feeling like they were, quote, pumping propaganda into us, end quote. Wasn't really thrilled with that interaction. And during that time, they ended up meeting up with the communist, in particular, Chow En-lai. And she would go on to say, quote, he was one really good man that we met in China, end quote. She believed that the future was theirs, of the communist. And they went back and reported that to the Treasury Department, and that wasn't well received for obvious reasons. And so it was a really exciting time in China, being able to see these aspects and getting to tell these stories of the individuals. So they get back. She's home for a year in Cuba, and she is getting tired of listening to the war on the radio. She wants to get into the action. She wants to be covering it. Hemingway, by 1943, was getting tired of hearing her talk about it, to the point where in a letter that he sent to her while she was in Italy said, "Are you a war correspondent or a wife in my bed?" And I hope that you hear that with the exact anger that you would assume Hemingway is saying this with, and his very big personality as well. Anyway, she went to Italy. She didn't care. She wanted to cover the war. She wasn't going to sit back and let societal expectations define her. She was going to go and do what she wanted to do. So in Italy, in this picture, you'll see she's actually with the 22nd Infantry Division scouting in Cassino. She would cover stories of orphans during this time. And a lot of her reflections on Italy talk about the French fighting the Germans. And what's interesting is by the time we're getting into 1943, there's lots of different camps on where France is. There's a group that still wants to see France liberated, and some they're just tired of hearing about it. And so at the end of her chapter on Italy, she goes on to say, pull the other book out, The Face of War. She goes on to say, quote, "You hear a lot of rot traveling around the world. You hear people say France is finished and the French are no good. Look at their politics. Look at the collapse of France. They will never be a great people again. So I lay in my cot and I thought that anyone who speaks or thinks that is a fool. And if he wants to know how foolish he is, he better visit Italy." And so you see here, she really is highlighting the tenacity of the Free French forces. She really does believe in this cause and wants to see the liberation of France, which will play a role in what happens for the future for her. So she comes home again, back to Cuba, and things aren't good. After her experience in Italy, she starts hearing rumblings about an invasion into France. This liberation movement's about to begin. And she wants to get that credential from Collier's. and isn't going to let anything stop her. Well, Hemingway, being the type of person that he is, decided that he wanted that credential instead. So he decides he's going to go to England in 1944 and steals her credential from Collier's, while also blocking her attempts to get to England. She actually was forced to cross the Atlantic in a ship filled with explosives because Hemingway refused to help her get a press pass on a plane. So she had to take an incredibly dangerous route across. Again, the U-boats that he wasn't ever able to find over off the coast of Cuba. But that was a real threat as they're crossing the Atlantic. She went a very dangerous route across. And during this time, while she's making her way over to England, he had begun an affair with Mary Walsh, a Times Magazine correspondent who would later become his fourth and final wife. So Martha Gellhorn arrives in England eventually. Takes a long way around, but she does get there. She arrives in London and finds Hemingway hospitalized with a concussion from a car accident, and unsympathetically ends things by saying, quote, that she was through, absolutely finished. So things start to change there. She's no longer involved with Hemingway. She's no longer worried about him. She gets to cover the stories that she wants. And so she starts really looking at stories about pilots who crashed their planes or were pulled from burning wreckage, and focusing on their scars and experiences from a personal and sensitive point of view instead of a ratings grab. She also took the time to get to know teenagers in England, learn about how they were coping with the war, and was surprised to learn that they actually had found joy in the worst of times, knowing that they were doing what was the right thing to do. And this story would later be published as with the title Children Are Soldiers Too. So clearly, if you know much about World War II, if you're in England in 1944, we're getting pretty close to D-Day at this point. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, Martha Gellhorn wanted to be the Collier's war correspondent for D-Day. Of course, Ernest Hemingway took that opportunity away from her, but it would be a disservice to not also mention that there was another female correspondent who was also trying to get onto the beaches of D-Day, and that is Helen Kirkpatrick. She had applied to accompany troops during the invasion. However, only men were selected to go. She waited and hoped that she'd be one of the first to go over in the days following the invasion. And if you figured anything out about Martha Gellhorn, that wasn't going to be the path that she would take, right? She's going to do whatever it takes to get the story, regardless of how she has to get there. And so one of her most famous articles from World War II is entitled The First Hospital Ship, and is looking at her time on D-Day as a part of this invasion. And so she had heard about this invasion and rushed to the waterfront and found a hospital ship. She came across some military police, and she lied and said that she was just going on board quickly to interview some nurses, flashed her accreditation real quick, and just ran. She got on and she stowed away in a bathroom. Now, she knew the risk. She knew that this could mean that she'd lose her accreditation, that she could be arrested, that she could be sent back to the United States. However, she believed that this was worth it to cover this invasion. Again, remember, she really believed in the French people and wanted to see this liberation happen. 2 other hospital ships on their way over to the beaches were hit mines along the way. And this third one would be the first to arrive at Normandy, situated near Omaha Beach between Dog Red and Easy Red sectors. So on D-Day, she had quite the story. And you'll notice, especially for the next 2 pieces of her World War II experience, I prefer to share it from her own words. And so as they're approaching the beach, she says, 2 of the launch crew, armed with boat hooks, hung over the side of the boat and stared at the black water, looking for obstacles, sunken vehicles, mines, and kept the hooks ready to push us off the sand as we came closer in. For the tides were a nasty business too, and part of the time, wounded had to be ferried out to the water ambulances on men's shoulders, and part of the time, The water ambulance is simply grounded and stuck on the beach together with other craft stranded by the fast-moving sea. So she knew how precarious the situation was, how difficult the situation was to navigate. You know, we talk often about the weather on D-Day and the challenges that presented for our soldiers as they were landing. She would eventually wade to shore and waist-high water, similar to what you're seeing in this photo of soldiers making their way onto the beach. And there was a sense of urgency to get as many wounded men back to the ship as possible. She would say as she got onto shore that everyone was violently busy on that crowded, dangerous shore. The pebbles were the size of melons, and we stumbled up a road that a huge road shovel was scooping out. We walked with the utmost care between the narrowly placed white tape lines that marked the mine-cleared path and headed for a tent marked with a red cross just behind the beach. Ducks and tanks and trucks were moving down this narrow, rocky road, and one just a little out of their way stepped, but not beyond the tapes. The dust that rose in the gray night light seemed like the fog of war itself. She would go on and sit and also assist the wounded, trying to get them from shore onto the water ambulances and then back onto the ship. She was taking note of all the things around her, really soaking in, as we mentioned earlier, the smells, the sights, what she's hearing. She wanted to be able to describe it as accurately as possible, but she also understood that there was a greater cause. So she didn't even bother writing until days later about this experience because she wanted to assist in any way that she could to care for the injured men on the ship. She goes on to talk about the injured men that she encountered in a way that really humanizes them. They're not machines of war. They're individual human beings who care about their fellow soldiers and have this greater sense of purpose. And so she says about them, but the wounded talked among themselves as time went on. We got to know them by their faces and their wounds, not their names. They were a magnificent, enduring bunch of men who smiled, even though they were in such pain that all they really can have wanted to do was turn their heads away and cry. And men made jokes when they needed their strength just to survive. And all of them looked after each other, saying, give that boy a drink of water. Miss, see that ranger over there? He's in bad shape. Could you go to him? All through the ship, men were asking after one another by name, anxiously, wondering if they were on board and how they were doing. She would go on for the rest of this chapter, telling specific stories about these individuals. And it really did capture what war is like, this very human side of the experience. It wasn't just about strategy and tactics on D-Day. It was about the men who were landing and what they were experiencing. So eventually they have to go back to England, right? And as I mentioned, she understood the risk. She got back, she was arrested, her credentials were stripped, and she was transported to a nurse's training camp. Now, I say all of this, she understood the risk, but she had one of the most well-received articles about D-Day. Now, let's not forget, I know I said I didn't want to talk too much about Hemingway from this point forward, but remember, he got the Collier's assignment for D-Day. He was a man, he was allowed to observe what was going on with the first wave. His LCVP never made it to shore. It ended up getting turned around because things were too dangerous. And there's some reports that he cowered in the face of the fighting. And I do want to point out the differences there. You know, again, that is speculation that he cowered, but Martha Gellhorn, she gets onto the shore and she wants to help. She sees what's going on and wants to help the wounded get back for treatment. And so it's really incredible what she did. And I think in some ways the military understood that, despite the consequences of her actions. They ended up giving her permission to go with the nurses again to get shipped off to Normandy. But in true Gellhorn fashion, that wasn't soon enough. That was going to be a few days to weeks later. She wanted to get back in the action immediately. So she ended up hitching a ride with a British pilot flying to Italy, who more than likely had no clue that she had been arrested. And I think this quote that you see on the screen right now really captures her mentality towards covering the war. I followed the war wherever I could reach it. I had been sent to Europe to do my job, which was not to report the rear areas or the women's angle. And so it's just incredible, the things that she would see and go on to report. And so after D-Day, of course, she's doing articles on lots of the other battles that are happening in the time, the 11 months between D-Day and the end of the war. But one that sticks with me in particular is her account of Dachau in May of 1945. She would go on to say, as you see on the screen, but nowhere was anything like this. Nothing about war was ever as insanely wicked as these starved and outraged, naked, and nameless dead. This article, she simply entitled Dachau, and it, towards the end, she was one of the first journalists to cover this camp, and you see that the liberation of Dachau made a profound impact on her by how she closes out the article in particular. And so, again, please indulge me one last time in reading from her own words. I don't think that me summarizing it's quite the same as how she captures it. The American soldier in the plane said, "We got to talk about it. You cannot talk about it very well because there is a kind of shock that sets in. It makes it almost unbearable to remember what you've seen. I have not talked about the women who were moved to Dachau 3 weeks ago from their own concentration camps. Their crime was that they were Jewish. There was a lovely girl from Budapest who somehow was still lovely, and the woman with mad eyes who had watched her sister walk into the gas chamber at Auschwitz and had been held back and refused the right to die with her sister, and the Austrian woman who pointed out calmly that they all had only the sleazy dresses they wore on their backs. They never had anything more, and that they worked outdoors 16 hours a day too in the long winters, and that they too were corrected, as the Germans say, for any offense, real or imaginary. I've not talked about how it was the day the American army arrived, though the prisoners told me. In their joy to be free and longing to see their friends who had come at last, many prisoners rushed to the fence and died electrocuted. There were those who died cheering because that effort of happiness was more than their bodies could endure. There were those who died because now they had food and they ate before they could be stopped and it killed them. I do not know the words to describe the men who have survived this horror for years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, and whose minds are as clear and unafraid as the day they entered. I was in Dachau when the German army surrendered unconditionally to the Allies. The same half-naked skeleton who had been dug out of the death train shuffled back into the doctor's office. He said something in Polish, his voice no stronger than a whisper. The Polish doctor clapped his hands gently and said, "Bravo." I asked what they were talking about. "The war is over," the doctor said. "Germany is defeated." We sat in that room in that accursed cemetery prison, and no one had anything more to say. Still, Dachau seemed to me the most suitable place in Europe to hear the news of victory, for surely this war was made to abolish Dachau and all the other places like Dachau and everything that Dachau stood for, and to abolish it forever. That's the end of World War II for her, that experience at Dachau. It was incredibly profound. She would later go on to compare war to a disease that causes pain beyond telling or imagining. After the war, she didn't go back to the life she had before. She didn't go to Cuba. She chose to stay in London and, quote, think of herself as something new. She would go on to adopt a son from Italy. I don't know if you remember what I mentioned about the stories that she covered in Italy, but it wasn't just the Free French Forces, it was also the orphans in Italy. So clearly her time in Italy had an impact on her as well, to where she chose to go back and adopt one of those orphans. And whenever the world was at war, she would choose to travel to those violent places and serve as a war correspondent. She would serve in, or report from the Arab-Israeli War, Vietnam, the Nicaraguan Contras, and the U.S. invasion of Panama. After a lifetime of writing about the war, although weapons and countries may be different, she believed that most wars are the same through their consequences: hunger, homelessness, fear, and pain. She ended her career covering war by turning down the job to go to Bosnia in 1992. She, right before that, had said that there has to be a better way to run the world, and we had better get to see it. After her decades of covering the war, her last years were spent in frail health. She was nearly blind. She was suffering from ovarian cancer that spread to her liver. And in true Gellhorn fashion, pushing societal boundaries, in February of 1998, she committed suicide in London by swallowing a cyanide capsule, taking her life, her end of life, into her hands. She was an incredible woman. She paved the way for women in journalism. She paved the way for women to be in the careers that they want to be in, for women to have independence. She is really one of those forerunners, and I hope that you take that away from today's lecture. And I really appreciate everyone joining me for this. I will now open things up for questions, but I will also note on the screen, my email address is there. So if there's anything you think of afterwards, please feel free to shoot me an email. I'd be happy to engage after the lecture as well.
All right, that was fascinating. What a great story. Makes me wonder when the movie's coming out. But while we wait for questions to come in, and for those of you listening, please put them in the chat or the Q&A feature, whichever platform you're watching, and it will show up on our screen here. But let me ask, while we're waiting for some others, did you run across any firsthand accounts, oral histories, a written memoir or something from any of the wounded men that she helped to treat?
I didn't. She doesn't use names in her writing, so it'd be very difficult to find those stories, and I'm not sure that many of the men would necessarily have known who she was in some of these instances. I think based off of everything I've read as well, she really did just want to keep things just like human beings, just having a basic conversation with you. She didn't want to make this an interview. She didn't want to flash her credentials and force you to speak to her. And so I think I almost wonder if a lot of these men just didn't know who she was either.
I would think that's likely true, because if someone's only trying to make you more comfortable, giving you some water, changing a bandage, whatever, she may not have been introduced. But I'd be curious if someone ever wrote about this angel of mercy. I don't know who she was. Maybe not, but be an interesting question. Another question's come in. Do you know if there was an official process to become a war correspondent, or was a media outlet able to send whoever they wanted? In other words, what are the requirements?
So back in World War II, there wasn't necessarily a process, right? You didn't go through, screenings and so forth. I think what helped her, as much as it pains me to say it, is her connection to Hemingway for World War II, that she was connected to this literary giant in getting through. She had also had experience as a journalist before as well. So I do think that helped her there. But as far as I'm aware, there is no real official process to becoming a war correspondent. You could just be very passionate about it, write articles, and move forward. It's very different now. Well, I guess in some ways not, though, right? Because there's Twitter, there's live streaming. I guess anyone could be.
Well, I guess it's true, right? You can just be a witness and become a war correspondent nowadays. But
absolutely.
Another question's come in from a name you'll recognize, your former boss, April, here in Bedford, who asks, I'm sure Martha Gellhorn would want to be remembered not for her marriage to Hemingway, but as a serious journalist. How do you think she would like to be remembered? And is there a particular account you think she would want us all to read?
Absolutely. This is a wonderful question, April. I'll start with the account first. I strongly recommend The Face of War. It starts really with her World War II experiences, but goes on to cover all of her time as a war correspondent up until she retired in 1992. So I definitely recommend that, because that's how she'd want to be remembered, right? She'd want to be remembered for the stories that she told during the war. I think she's very proud, or was very proud of her time covering the Great Depression as well, and telling these stories of ordinary individuals. I definitely don't think she would be thrilled with how she's often remembered as being the wife of Hemingway. And to John's point, there is a movie about this. It doesn't go into quite as much detail as Hemingway and Gellhorn. And of course, it's also alphabetical, but I think there's a reason they put Hemingway first, to try to capture people's attention. But there is a movie on HBO or Max that tells this story, but again, it's very much from Hemingway's point of view. I don't think she'd be thrilled about that at all.
I think we should remember Hemingway as Martha Gellhorn's husband instead.
Exactly.
But, interesting. I've been fascinated the last few years with the experiences of war correspondents, not just the ladies like Martha Gellhorn, but all of them, because they so much informed the public at home. This was how many of the soldiers at the time understood what was going on. From war correspondents' work, very much impacted the way the home fronts understood the war, and in many ways were putting themselves at great risk of running toward the guns in some cases, riding on bombers. It is a fascinating story, and Martha Gellhorn's is one of the most fascinating of the whole bunch.
Absolutely, and I think I agree with you very much on this. And I think it even goes back to that process for war correspondents. Think about Ernie Pyle, literary great of his time. It's incredible that these men as well, who are known for their novels and other writings, chose to go into war and report from the fronts as well. And so it's
Very
fascinating.
true. In the way the experience shaped a lot of the future giants.
Exactly.
Walter Cronkite was right there. Andy Rooney. This is where they cut their teeth, and it shows up in their careers later on into the 70s and the 80s.
Exactly.
So, well, I don't see any other questions. Excuse me, any other questions that popped in. But if you have one, Maggie's email was shown earlier, and you can email education@dday.org, and we'll be happy to pass on any questions or comments as well to Maggie. But for now, we'll say thank you, Dr. Hartley, for joining us today for the great presentation. One last thing I tell us just very quickly. People can always check out our webpage, dday.org, and see what we have planned for the 80th anniversary of D-Day this summer. What are you doing down there in New Orleans?
Absolutely. So I often joke that when I came to the National World War II Museum, I didn't expect to be as wrapped up into the major anniversaries of D-Day, and that was not true. So it's very exciting, though. For those of you guys who are not as familiar with the National World War II Museum, it did start out as the National D-Day Museum just a year before the memorial opened. So there's a very rich history of telling the story about June 6, 1944 here in New Orleans. And so for the 80th anniversary, we have quite a few different things going on. We have on-site events happening here in New Orleans. It includes an 8-hour remembrance ceremony. We have even a contingent from the 29th Division Band coming down for a concert with us. We'll have our traditional Dr. Hal Baumgarten D-Day commemoration ceremony. For those of you who are not as familiar with Dr. Baumgarten, he was attached to the 29th and knew many of the Bedford boys. And so it's one of my privileges to still have that connection to Bedford in what I do on an annual basis. And that evening, we are going to have an open house in our Louisiana Memorial Pavilion, which features a C-47, as well as our original D-Day exhibit. And I will give you guys a quick little hint that we'll be going into refurbishment soon. It's the original one from June 6, 2000. So it's going to be 24 years old very, very soon. But we're excited to freshen it up and bring it up to the standards of our other galleries. And after that, we'll close out the evening of June 6th with a lecture with Rick Atkinson. It'll also be live streamed for those of you who aren't able to make it to New Orleans. The next day is a day full of symposium. We're having historians from all over the country, as well as some even internationally, coming in to discuss D-Day +1, what happens after the beaches as they push into Paris. That's not all that's happening with the World War II Museum. As I was joking with John about, we don't just do on-site, we take it to another level. We also have our D-Day 80 cruise that is starting in England and heading over to Normandy. There are still some spots available, and we're really happy to say that we have 9 World War II veterans traveling on that cruise as well. So there's incredible historians and opportunity to have one-on-one experiences with World War II veterans. And so it's going to be a busy time, as I know it's going to be in Bedford as well. So appreciate everyone's support. And for both of these causes, I think the most important thing is to make sure that we're remembering the men who landed on the beaches in the 4,415. Is that still the number? Men who lost their lives on that day.
And counting.
And counting, yes.
We keep researching. So very great. Sounds exciting. And I encourage our listeners and viewers, if you've never been, if you're a World War II buff, and I'm guessing if you're watching this Lunchbox lecture and listening to our podcast, you're a World War II buff. If you've never been to the World War II Museum in New Orleans, it's just a great experience. So put that on your bucket list. And of course, if you haven't been to the National D-Day Memorial, put that on your list as well. So Maggie, again, thank you very much for a fascinating talk, for a great look back. And we hope we'll see you here in Virginia very soon, if at all possible. But we know they keep you busy down there in New Orleans. So maybe after all of the 80th, activities are over, you can find time to head up here. And in the meantime, maybe some of us will pop down there and see you as well.
Please.
So again, just thank you all who have joined us for this Lunchbox lecture. Encourage you to come back, check our webpage frequently for all of our events coming up. But our next Lunchbox lecture will actually be me speaking of that necrology project and how it came about, how we're continuing to research, how those names ended up at the wall here at the National D-Day Memorial, and why we want to remember each one of those men from all of the Allies who gave life and up to secure our freedom. So join us for that one in April. And in the meantime, we'll say thank you for joining us, and thank you to Maggie, and hope to see you soon.